Thank you for inviting. Hello. America is going through complicated times. Difficulties that some of us have only read about in history books are arising, and solutions are not only scarce, but can also be more complicated than the issues themselves. At times like this is when we need strong leadership, and we receive our leadership from government officials. On November 4, we will go vote, and we will decide who those officials will be. In order to pick the best one for the country, we need to make educated decisions, but how do we wade through political propaganda and get to the bottom of things? How do we figure out who will be the best for the job? Throughout history, the media has served the people by portraying the right and wrongdoing of the government and by telling the government how we feel about the issues. Yet sometimes the media strays from their job, and instead of focusing on what's best for the people, they focus on what's best for the government. Ray Suarez is here today to talk about this. Mr. Suarez has over 30 years of experience in the news business. He has worked for CNN, CBS Radio, ABC Radio, and BBC Radio, amongst others. For 6 years, he was host of NPR's Talk of the Nation, a nationwide calling news program, and in 1999, Suarez joined the News Hours with Jim Lehrer, where he is currently a senior correspondent in PBS. Suarez has published 2 books, The Old Neighborhood, What We Lost in the Great Suburban Migration, which was published in 1999, and the recent The Holy Vote, The Politics of Faith in America, published in 2006. He has also won numerous awards, including the 1996 Rubén Salazar Award from the National Council of La Raza, Current History's 1995 Global Awareness Award, and the 2005 Distinguished Policy Leadership Award from UCLA's School of Public Policy. Suarez holds a BA in African History from New York University and an MA in Social Sciences from the University of Chicago. As a journalist and as a Hispanic woman, I find all of these facts impressive. At this time, I only dream of achievements such as the one that Suarez holds. But what I am mostly impressed by, and what makes me believe Suarez is someone worth listening to, is the fact that he is not content with the status quo. He is willing to show us, the media, what we're doing wrong in order to once again make it a service to the people. Ladies and gentlemen, Ray Suarez.
Thanks for coming out tonight. You know, in Prague, they have a Rococo landmark called the Loreto Chapel. And tradition holds that it was the home of the Virgin Mary in the Holy Land, and that it levitated and just flew through the night and came to rest in Prague. And when you're in this room, you could imagine that a building could levitate, because this church looks like it was plucked out of Tuscany and just sort of dropped here. It is a magnificent space, and thank you for hosting me in it. And what a great time to be here to talk about the election. Okay, how many watched the debate last night? Not bad. How many are still undecided? Okay. Who won? Greenberg Quinlan Rosner, a polling firm with mostly Democratic clients, assembled a field of some 60 undecided voters last night to watch the debate, and contrasted the reaction of last night's viewers to those of a similar field who watched the first debate between the presidential candidates. In the first debate, about half remained undecided after the debate, and the other half split evenly between the two candidates on stage. Last night, the pollsters say, they saw something quite different. Fewer of the participants remained undecided after watching last night's debate, and of those who declared a preference after watching the debate, a greater percentage preferred Barack Obama. In sifting the results, the polling firm concluded that as we enter the final phase of this election season, it's not so much one particular issue or another that's pushing this slow and steady move toward Senator Obama, but an accumulating sense of his plausibility. The group that watched the debate last night is arriving at the point where they are seeing someone who they believe could really be president. Now, you'll hear it said with great confidence from time to time that a poll is meaningless all on its own. And I think there's some merit to that idea, because it is only a snapshot. And I think what you should be watching for in the coming days is a cumulative trend of polls from several different companies taken over a spread of several days. These impressions may yet mesh to form an overall picture of the race as we enter these exciting, excruciating last weeks. Now, here in Michigan, where John McCain's campaign has in recent days folded its tent, some of that suspense may be waning. Campaigns only make that kind of decision in the final month when they think a state is in the bag, so any further money spent is unnecessary, or when a state is out of reach. Michigan off the table makes for a much more daunting map for Team McCain, and we can talk more about that later if you like. But having said all that, it's especially fun to have been on a college campus today, less than a month before the most exciting national election of my career. Not only don't I know who's going to win, but it'll be weeks before we even know what conditions will be in place to drive the final undecideds, you people in the back, to the polls. Whether the new voters Barack Obama will be relying on will really show up. If the large turnout of black voters that might make states like North Carolina, Virginia, and Florida closer, whether the Latino voters who could make New Mexico, Colorado, and Nevada possible for Barack Obama are really going to show up this time. My own skepticism comes from being confidently told in interviews during the 80s, 90s, and 00s that the next election would bring minority voters to new prominence. It was always the next election in the electorate, only to watch it not happen. And ditto with the youth vote. The most delayed vote. I've been waiting so long for the youth vote that the youth I was waiting for are now middle-aged. So, one possible upside to the McCain withdrawal from Michigan, to my way of thinking, is that you don't have to watch as many campaign commercials as those of us who live in or near battleground states. Since I live in a media market that includes Northern Virginia, I'm treated to the full blast of the worst that both campaigns can dish out. So I'm contemplating a move to Rhode Island. While it's been said 1,000 times in the last few months that this election is different from any other, with a different context, with the country in a different place, on one level, this shouldn't even be close. And that's what makes it fascinating. It shouldn't be close for reasons having little to do with the candidates themselves. More people saying the country is on the wrong track than ever before in the history of public opinion researchers asking the question. Capitalism in the middle of a nervous breakdown, with the Democratic candidate having a 20-point advantage among voters when they're asked, who has your confidence in being able to handle the economy? And the issue the candidates originally thought was going to be the main issue, the Iraq War, not so much off the map as just receding in importance as other things are sort of filling up the windscreen. A majority of voters from both parties now think it was a mistake to go to war in Iraq. It's a bare majority among Republicans and a huge majority among Democrats. Yet the nominee of the incumbent president's party has been close or ahead through much of the election season. This is new territory. In recent weeks, the financial crisis, which has actually been bubbling away for months, has taken a decided turn for the worse. People are feeling poorer. Their retirement plans are worth less. Their homes are worth less. And even though many of these people are not trying to sell their houses right now or aren't going to retire right now, that sense that you are poorer today than you were a month ago or a year ago drives your spending habits, drives plans about the near future, drives voter sentiments about the economy. And this is not good news for John McCain, as the economy months ago passed national security as voters' number one concerns. The just-released Wall Street Journal NBC poll has the Democrat 6 points ahead of his senatorial colleague and Republican rival. Most polls show Obama ahead, anywhere from a little to a lot. McCain and his running mate have responded by seeking to drive voter anxieties about Barack Obama's relatively short public career, working hard in stump speeches and television commercials to increase concern that the Illinois Democrat is risky, inexperienced, and unknown, or a so-called Chicago machine politician, though anyone who knows anything about Chicago politics would find that notion ridiculous. Hyde Park liberals are never part of the Chicago machine. But that line of attack gives the McCain-Palin campaign a chance to invoke Chicago and its image of shady backroom deals and political muscle on the street. Sarah Palin told crowds over the weekend that, quote, Barack Obama is not a man who sees America like you and I see America. She was leading up to the point that Obama, quote, pals around with terrorists. What the next 30 days will tell us is whether this gambit will work, or whether or not it's coming too late. Public opinion researchers have found since the beginning of the second Bush term that there are really inherent problems with the Republican brand that have nothing to do with Barack Obama's weaknesses or strengths as a candidate, especially in response to questions about whether the parties understand the problems of people like me. The Republican score in that question has been declining for years. And whether Republicans seem able to help them with health care and education. Again, voter sentiment really souring just in recent years. The two nominees didn't create the problems, were not instrumental in driving the voter sentiment in these areas, but they have to run in a country that feels that way. John McCain has spent virtually his entire life on one government payroll or another, and much of his adult life in Washington. And he's been doing something that you might thus think is counterintuitive, running on having more experience than the other guy while at the same time separating himself from Washington and everybody who's been in charge. He's running on experience while choosing a running mate who arguably brings virtues other than experience to the ticket. What makes John McCain plausible, what makes him tied up until the last few weeks, is Barack Obama. And, of course, John McCain's own biography. This is a personality campaign rather than a programmatic one. You're not being asked to choose between two sets of plans as much as between two sets of personalities, histories, and a sort of collection of personal attributes. You don't hear as much the campaign saying, this is what I'm going to do, and here's how I'm going to do it, as much as this is who I am and how much I am like you. The candidates are not heading out to voters around the country and over the airwaves offering a long laundry list of governmental programs, innovations, policy prescriptions. Instead, we hear a lot about captivity in Vietnam, or being a community organizer on the south side of Chicago, or being a hockey mom, or losing your wife and child in a terrible accident and how that changed your life. Let me tell you a little secret. You can keep a secret, right? If I wasn't a reporter, I would not care at all as a citizen that Joe Biden was born in Scranton. Especially since he left there as a young kid and really grew up in Delaware. And I would care even less, as little as I would care about that in Joe Biden's case, I would care even less that Hillary Clinton's father was born in Scranton. These are symbolic variables meant to convey a series of meanings without having much content. It seems that in 2008, being a regular guy is now the coin of the realm, even as some of the most revered presidents in American history were anything but regular guys. Not John McCain's hero, Teddy Roosevelt, who went to Brooks Brothers to have his uniform made to be the leader of the Rough Riders. Not the man to whom Barack Obama is often compared, John Kennedy. Governor Sarah Palin has strewn the landscape with symbolic assertions to present her regular gal bona fides, calling herself middle class even as she and her husband make 4 times what the median American family does. And even though 80% of the country lives in metropolitan areas, real American averageness is oddly enough achieved by spending a big chunk of your life in a town of 8,000 people. Of course, this leaves my own presidential hopes very much in jeopardy. Though, I was the first person in my family to go to college. My father was a barber and a small business owner. My mother was a school aide. I'm an Eagle Scout, and I go to church every Sunday. But unfortunately, I cannot aspire to regular guy status because instead of a modest, clapboard house with a white picket fence somewhere in a rural area, I grew up in an apartment in Brooklyn, New York, and my family speaks with an accent. So in our bizarre formula for awarding regular guy cred, I haven't got a shot, I'm afraid. Even though, once you got to know me, I think you would find me highly regular. But that's a rant for another day. But you get what I'm saying. Symbols, biography, things, in fact, over which the individual politician sometimes had little or no control, become part of a pile of variables that's supposed to win you, the voter, over. John McCain was the son and grandson of admirals. His father was a fast friend of the top-tier Washington elite during McCain's teenage and young adult years. But that is neutralized in the biography presented by McCain and his campaign by his time spent in Vietnam. And oddly enough, frees the Republican nominee to hurl the elitist label at the other guy, who was from, to say the least, a very unpromising background, who parlayed his smarts into a strong academic career, which eventually allowed him to enter the highest precincts in the American power structure. Now, in real life, most voters know as little about John McCain and Joe Biden as they know about Barack Obama. And if you still, with a couple of weeks to go until Election Day, still say things like, "But who is this guy really?" Like John McCain said just in the last couple of days, I would submit you just haven't been paying much attention to a campaign that's been grinding steadily forward for almost 2 years. Their backgrounds, schooling, formative years, spouses, children have been endlessly examined, profiled, talked about, hashed over, analyzed. Yet one candidate in particular still gets the, "But I don't really know him," and "Who is this guy?" and "I really have to know more about him" response than any other, and that's Barack Obama. What is it, do you figure, that still makes him a stranger after 21 months of a national campaign? Any guesses? Anyone? One of the most difficult things to measure in any scientifically sound way is how much racial calculus enters into people's decision-making. Because unlike the public opinion surveys of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, when people were much more willing to tell Gallup about their ugly racial feelings, it's harder to get people to open up on these questions now. Politicians can have no hope of a prominent public career if they are openly racist. The ground has simply shifted under our feet in that way. I mean, think back to just a couple of years ago when the Senate Majority Leader was taken down from the heights of power by an offhand remark about Strom Thurmond. Trent Lott himself didn't do the things that Strom Thurmond did. Trent Lott himself was a fairly standard politician of his generation, really, in a lot of ways, but lost his gig because he said a nice thing about Strom Thurmond on the man's 100th birthday. Bad move, Trent. But that just shows you how far we've come in the 50 years since Southern sheriffs were sicking German shepherds on protesters and lunch counter sit-in people. The pseudo-controversies do continue anyway about Barack Obama's birth certificate. Anybody been following this one? This sort of underground movement to find Barack Obama's real birth certificate in order to prove that he wasn't actually born in Honolulu, where he and the Board of Health of the county that Honolulu is in say that, yes, he in fact was born there. His father's religion, his time spent overseas in Indonesia. These may all be ways of refusing to confer the privilege of Americanness on him. It's a way of exoticizing him, a way of using proxies for race in order to remove him from the mainstream of American life. One of the ironies being that John McCain is the only major party nominee who was not born in the United States. He was born in the Panama Canal Zone, but has not yet rolled the dice by emphasizing that point in order to make a stronger play for the Latino vote. Though he may become the first president born in Central America. And I think really there's also Mitt Romney, whose father was born in Mexico and had been under consideration for the vice presidential slot, and maybe the Republicans were missing a bet there, taking a pass on a ticket with the presidential nominee born in Panama and his running mate, the son of a man born in Mexico. Who would really get to use the slogan, "Si se puede," then? Of course, I'm kidding, but let me talk a little bit more about the Latino vote. It's been an area of intense concern for both Republicans and Democrats. The GOP's top strategists have long believed that their party could be and should be doing better among Latinos who they see as Republicans in training. Socially conservative, Roman Catholic, increasingly members of evangelical Protestant churches, strongly family-centered. Quietly, those same Republican strategists will tell you that in the near term, they weren't really looking to carry a majority of this growing vote, just to do well enough to deny Democrats majorities in places like Florida, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, and Nevada, places with large Latino communities and growing numbers of voters. The idea is that if Republicans can get their share of that vote to 40% or just past it, several states slip through the grasp of the Democratic Party. Former Texas Governor George W. Bush did better than his predecessors Bob Dole and George H.W. Bush, and indeed, Republicans won all those states I mentioned in 2004. But the angry national argument over immigration came between the last presidential election and this one, and did a couple of things that may turn out to have an interlocking effect next month. The growing anti-immigrant sentiment in the country that started out as an anti-illegal immigrant argument and then morphed into soul-searching about immigration, period, drove many people who had been living here a long time as legal residents to naturalize and register to vote. So surveys strongly showed Latinos who were already voters felt increased hostility from the Republican Party. And that same perception of hostility pushed tens of thousands of permanent residents to become naturalized citizens at a time when new registrations already favored the Democrats. To make for lopsided gains in Democratic Party registration in the very states most hotly contested in this election. Now, I use my words carefully, perceptions of hostility, because it was only a minority of the Republican caucus in the House that really showed any willingness to get way out ahead on this issue, to propose new measures for mass deportations or crackdowns that were seen as anti-immigrant, or raise the temperature of the debate in a way that caused those feelings of threat. Along with Tom Tancredo of Colorado and James Sensenbrenner of Wisconsin, there were moderate governors in states like Florida and California, Republican governors, that worked hard to keep relationships strong with immigrant communities. And the Texas governor turned president, George W. Bush, was the one who proposed comprehensive immigration reform that included a path to citizenship for most illegal immigrants, a move championed in the Senate by another border state senator, John McCain, who, as he got a look at the way the wind was blowing in his own party, denounced his own bill and said if it came up for a vote now, he wouldn't vote for it. I was talking to Florida Senator Mel Martinez, who, as a former chairman of the party, saw all the internal numbers on voter sentiment and registration and said it would take years, perhaps decades, for the Republicans to get back to where they were in 2000 among Latino voters, much less make gains. Reports are now coming from across the South of an energized black vote, large numbers of new Democratic registrations, and the economic numbers added on make it a challenging year for any Republican presidential candidate, quite apart from specific issues or appeals to different sectors of the electorate. You have to remember that after 8 years of a presidency, or 8 years of one party's tenure in the White House, it can be difficult to propel that same party's nominee into office to make it 12 years, no matter what party or what president is involved. George H.W. Bush managed it in 1988 after 8 years as the number 2 to a very popular president. Bill Clinton and Al Gore almost pulled it off in 2000. But imagine how much harder it is when the incumbent president has proven to be one of the most unpopular in history. This is a tremendous handicap to the McCain-Palin ticket, and they know it. It was no accident that Sarah Palin chided Joe Biden during their recent debate for looking backward instead of looking forward when complaining about GOP stewardship of the presidency. Now, the looking backward charge might have been a more effective one if George W. Bush wasn't still president of the United States, like today and for months to come. That's not looking backward, that's looking out the window. But the Republican ticket right now is trying to figure out how to put distance between itself and the current president. And it's a very tricky challenge because disowning the president has its own risks for a Republican candidate. While you're working hard to reach out to independents who have long since soured on the Bush administration, you also have to keep Republican voting groups like white evangelicals in the tent. And they are among the last voters in America who show a majority favoring George W. Bush as a president. Harshly denounce the Bush years to one group, and you risk losing another. And in the age of 24-hour news coverage, mini cameras, blogs, instant web posting, and YouTube, a tried and true part of national campaigns, saying one thing to one group and something slightly different to another, has just gotten a lot harder. And candidates have to assume that everything they say might end up being heard, and soon, by everybody. Ask O.J. Simpson. He didn't know he was being recorded either. Before I close, let's take a look at religion in our politics, which after you buy my book, you'll be able to do at greater leisure. This has been a fascinating election season, reaching all the way back to the earliest days of the race for people who watch that particular aspect of presidential races. I argued in my book, The Holy Vote, that the high watermark of religionized politics was reached in the re-election of George Bush in 2004, and that religious appeals would continue to be a part of the way we run campaigns, but in a more subtle way. I could not foresee a campaign in which the Democratic nominee for president would be the guy in the race who talks about his religion in a complex and thoughtful way, while the Republican would be the one who comes to the race after a long career as an essentially secular politician and is decidedly uncomfortable talking about matters of faith. But that's where we are. These stereotypical roles have been reversed. But because of the two particular people involved, it hasn't really mattered all that much. And why? Because instead of being able to develop any particular advantage among voters for whom a publicly acknowledged strong religious faith is a plus, Senator Obama is instead forced to fight a rearguard action to prove he's a Christian in the first place. The internet blasts, the web-based whisper campaigns, which then give respectability and a kind of cover to more openly voiced speculation on radio talk and right-wing television, has religion becoming a proxy for race. Recently, a panel of religion writers at Fordham University, taking a look at the 2008 elections, said it seemed to them that continuing to insist that Barack Obama is a Muslim was a way of continuing to confer otherness on him without having to say out loud, "I'm not comfortable with the fact that he's black." But at the same time as Barack Obama has to figure out a way to respond to the suggestion that he's a Muslim, he's also got to defend the brand of Christian his detractors say that he's been, which is an odd straddle for any candidate. Though he hasn't been the star of the fall campaign, I would look for the Reverend Jeremiah Wright to come bursting back on the scene in the next 3 weeks. The McCain campaign is already publicly toying with the idea of reattaching Wright to Obama's hip, knowing as they do that Wright's fiery brand of black liberation theology, his provocative preaching, his incendiary sound bites play particularly dismally with the very voters Obama has to win over in order to prevail in places like Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Indiana, where, incidentally, McCain is still ahead, but it's closer than any Republican would have expected. Governor Palin spoke to columnist Bill Kristol at the New York Times and signaled the return of the problematic Reverend Wright. She said, "I don't know why that association isn't discussed more." Innocently, she just speculatively. Those were appalling things that pastor had said about our great country. And to have sat in the pews for 20 years and listened to that with, I don't know, a sense of condoning it, I guess, because he didn't get up and leave, to me, that does say something about character. It would be unworthy of me as a lecturer and unworthy of you as an audience if I tried to do that in Alaska dialect, but you can hear it in your head. At this late stage in the game, with the extensive coverage given to all the candidates' lives, depending on the poll, some 10 to 15% of voters who oppose Obama still say it's because he's Muslim. I'm not sure it's significant in electoral terms because even if you could prove that idea false, how many of that 10 to 15% would now be for Obama? See how it doesn't really push the needle very much either way? The people who are still saying he's a Muslim probably would not be people who would consider voting for him in the first place. But it is interesting as a cultural phenomenon. One of the few times the Constitution mentions religion at all is to say that there is no religious test for holding public office in the United States. But apart from the legal requirement that there be no religious test, we as voters may have our own requirement quite apart from the letter of the law. Public opinion researchers have asked voters for years whether they would support an atheist for president. And vast majorities of Americans say they would not. As a matter of fact, the number that say they would not is so high that I suspect that there are even atheists among that group who say they wouldn't vote for an atheist for president. So we have this informal notion in our head that we want a person of faith to be president. Or as Mitt Romney said in his speech at the Bush Presidential Library before the Iowa caucuses, Americans want a president who's a believer, but it's less important to them what religion that president professes. But not, as it turns out, in the case of Islam. Let's be clear. It's not proud Muslims continuing to hint that Barack Obama is one too because they're so tickled that one of their own might become president. The idea is being spread by people who realize that since 9/11, and even before that, it was a fairly short stroll in the American mind from Islam to terrorism and anti-Americanism. And it would serve as an immediate disqualification from consideration for many Americans. Senator Obama is poised in the next few weeks to suffer the consequences of being a Muslim and the wrong kind of Christian all at the same time. The McCain campaign is ready to pile on the doubt. John McCain spoke at the University of New Mexico earlier this week and took a much tougher line on his opponent, calling him a mystery, a liar, complicit in the economic crisis, unaccomplished and naive. Fasten your seatbelts. There's a lot more where that came from. And the Obama campaign has indicated that it's prepared to respond in kind. What remains to be seen is whether the Democrats will stick strictly to the public record and train their fire on items in McCain's resume like his membership in the Keating Five, as he and other senators intervened personally with bank regulators on behalf of a crooked SNL executive, or whether independent 527 groups like those of Swiftboat fame will be unleashed to bring up unflattering details about John McCain's personal life. Earlier in the season, the Arizona senator had discouraged campaign attacks using Jeremiah Wright, going so far as to publicly order the South Carolina Republican Party to stop running ads that featured Jeremiah Wright. But being behind with 4 weeks to go may yet soften that prohibition. One way or another, it's a momentous election. The next president is going to have to figure out Iraq, is going to be presented with urgent demands to meet needs at home among the tens of millions of uninsured, the growing millions of unemployed, and families pushed to the wall by rapidly growing prices for everything, from gas to food to tuition, at a time when wages are stagnant or falling. The next president's hands may be tied by the fastest rate of growth in the national debt in the history of the United States. People are weary of the current president, but the next president may be forced to say, we can't do these things we need to do, at least not right away. It's amazing that anybody wants the job at all, really, but so many do. It's been a fascinating race, an exciting race, and 4 nail-biting weeks stretch out from yesterday. Thanks for having me with you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now open the floor for questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, if you can please step up to either of the mics up in front here.
I would like to say something that's important to a lot of people. There were there were different groups, about 3 different groups registering people to vote, and a lot of people have not received acknowledgement that they are registered. And that is really a serious problem for them because they don't know if they can vote or not. And I'm just saying this so that someone will bring it to the attention of someone that can perform and mail those registration cards to people.
Yes. Hi, Mr. Suarez.
Hiya.
Hi. A couple of decades ago, I lived in Los Angeles under Mayor Bradley, a black mayor, and everyone I knew there liked the guy. The blacks loved him, the Hispanics loved him, the whites loved him. He was seen as a very effective leader. Now, later I moved back to Michigan, and I kind of lost track. But somebody recently told me that he ran for governor later and was expected to succeed by all the polls, yet when they counted the ballots, he lost due to a 14-point swing in white votes in the ballot box. I guess, is the Bradley effect real? And is there any possibility we're going to wake up November 5 to a disaster?
The pollsters that I've been speaking to in the last couple of weeks are desperately trying to figure out whether they can use question design to sort of lift the lid on that and figure out whether people are telling the truth about their voting intentions. I suspect there are people who, once they get into the privacy of the voting booth, will change their minds and do something that they weren't expected to do. The question is, how many? I don't think that with a very unpopular incumbent and people who have been decided for a long time, that is as likely. Will there be some shrinkage in the numbers? Probably. But the undecideds, even the small percentage of undecideds, tend to break toward the person who's ahead unless there's some event in the last 72, 96 hours before the polls open. Some of the Bradley effect may be blunted by a tremendous change in the way we vote in the more than 20 years since Tom Bradley ran for governor. Millions of people are voting right now. And they're voting based on what we know and what we're thinking and what we're talking about today. And their vote will be, in effect, carved in stone. So even if there is some game-changing event in the last 72 hours or 96 hours or a sudden revelation or some embarrassing thing that happens, their vote is cast. And that might blunt some of that last-minute, I don't know if I can really do this kind of rethinking that people are afraid of. So is there going to be a Bradley effect? Hard to know. There's reasons to think there might be, and there's good reasons to think there won't be. So there you go. Glad I could settle that for you.
With Palin's recent linkage of Obama with Avery, I'm wondering if, by calling him an associate of terrorists, if there isn't actually a subtle, dangerous edge to that sort of linkage that, considering Obama being the first black candidate, sort of a perilous thing to inject into the campaign. Your thoughts?
Well, perilous or promising, depending on your point of view. I mean, it's certainly no accident that the locution palling around with terrorists was used. It didn't suddenly pop into somebody's head and at the last minute, and it's been thought about very carefully. The reemergence of Bill Ayers is not an accident, and if your whole strategy at this point is to continue to cast doubt, what would cast more doubt than trying to bring up an association with a guy who was a member of the Weather Underground, whose wife was a member of the Weather Underground, who were both implicated in bombings of public buildings. This is not mythology about Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn. It's real. And the only question is whether this kind of thing can make Ayers stick to Obama. They really are not friends. They were associates on members of not-for-profit boards in Chicago. My son went to Bernardine Dorn's daycare center, so I guess I was palling around with terrorists too. He is an acknowledged, and it's funny because inside the context of Chicago, Bill Ayers is a very different public figure. Nobody thinks of Richard M. Daley as a guy who would have been in the Weather Underground. People say many things about him, but never that. And he's been an associate and consulted with Bill Ayers for years on his reform of the Chicago public schools. It's a funny old world. Inside the culture of Chicago, those fights have already been had. Those second thoughts have already been expressed. Those things have been written about in the papers, and it's been over for a long time. But then when you take it to a wider public that doesn't see this in the Chicago context, and why should they? Why should somebody in South Carolina see something in the Chicago context? What you leave out becomes as important as what you put in to an allegation. And it becomes something that Barack Obama, I think, would be well advised to worry about a great deal. It doesn't matter if you read after the jump and the New York Times story says, they really weren't, that close and really didn't know each other that well, because political campaigns are not a read past the jump sort of enterprise. Campaign commercials are 30 seconds long. They consist of about 4 thoughts and an approval from the candidate at the end. So, Bill Ayers should worry them over there at Obama campaign headquarters.
First, I just wanted to offer a comment to the young lady. Anyone that has registered to vote, especially in these last weeks, I say go vote anyhow. Just know that your clerk's office, whatever county or city that you're in, are busy or we're busy registering those people. It may not have cards in hand, but you do not need your registration card at the ballot on the day of the vote. So please just encourage everyone to still go and vote. All right? Secondly, I wanted to just ask you, as someone who watches the news and watch the polls that are put out by respective television stations, how exactly do they know when they state that 25% of the black people voted for this, and how can they really tell? Please tell me if there's a secret to how they dissect the votes into race and women votes. Is there something that we are putting on our ballots? I don't know. You're in media. Help us out.
Well, let me explain a little of that. I'm not going to give a lecture on the science of polling, but what you do is you pick a group of people meant to represent a much larger group of people, and that's your sample. And if your sample is designed well and collected properly, it will be a rough proxy for a wider number of people. So if your sample, let's say you're polling in a New York City mayor's race, and you've got a sample of 1,002 registered voters, and then when you check your sample, 51% are women and 49% are men, and roughly 25% are black and 20% are Latino and 10% are Asian. And if it's kind of like New York, your sample design is considered pretty reliable. And they also check party registrations for the mix of Republican, Democrat, and Independent and all those things. And then you ask your questions. And those respondents, then, depending on the sample, then they have some multipliers added to them. This is where it starts to get kind of complicated, because they assume undercounts of certain kinds of voters, so they might add a little multiplier to magnify the result for voters 17 to 25 because they're often underpolled, because they don't have hardwired home telephones and instead rely more heavily on cell phones. They might put in a multiplier for Latino voters because they are less likely to be listed in the phone book and respond to pollsters' calls. And they start to work on the numbers, and then they come up with what they think is a rough representation of the electorate as a whole. Sometimes samples are designed badly, sometimes questions are designed badly, and you get outlier results. But if you've been looking at the presidential polling, roughly over the past month, a lot of it's been saying kind of the same thing. So there may be one poll that's way out over here and one poll that's way out over there, but a lot of them cluster around a certain set of impressions about the electorate. Some might have a slight underrepresentation of urban voters, and one might have a slight underrepresentation of suburban voters, and so on. But over time, a poll of polls gets you pretty close to a true picture. 3-day polls sometimes try to catch the dynamism in voter opinion, especially after an event like a debate, where you're trying to see trends in the electorate and see them measured against an event that happened in time, like, Sarah Palin's acceptance speech as the vice presidential nominee, which got a huge audience, got rave reviews, especially among Republicans, but even among independents as well, and for a while carried the fortunes of the McCain ticket along with it. Some of that is now dying down, and tracking polls are capturing that as it's happening as well. But the science of sample size, sample design, and question design, the best pollsters get it roughly right, and the other pollsters sometimes fudge a little bit. But it's as much an art as a science in some ways. Yes.
Good evening. I wanted to just thank you for the News Hour, which I enjoy, and of course before that your work on Talk of the Nation. I thought you brought a great deal of depth to all the discussions I heard you with and perform. And just curious if you would ever consider a gig at a commercial network, say as a host of Meet the Press.
Well, if you know anybody at NBC, tell them to give me a call. I don't think I'd last very long on Meet the Press, frankly. I don't have a great deal of patience for accepted Washington wisdom, and I would ask impertinent questions, and they'd find some other job for me at NBC. I suspect is what would happen. Yes.
Mr. Suarez, Since the 1980 election, evangelical Christians have constituted one of the core voting blocs on which the Republican Party relies. Given that evangelicals are almost exclusively white, and given the fact that this election has the potential of invigorating an increasing number of racial minorities into political action, do you feel that it will no longer be tenable for the Republican Party to rely on evangelical Christians as their party base?
There is a, as you hint at in your question, there is a terminology problem. What we call the evangelical vote should really more properly be called the white evangelical vote, since the majority of black Americans are evangelical Christians and very few of them vote Republican. So when we say the evangelical vote is the base of the Republican coalition, what we really mean is the white evangelical vote. Having said that, there is likely to be some change because in January 2009, George W. Bush will leave office. And when he does, sex education will still be taught in the public schools. Abortion will still be legal in the United States. And many of the goals, the publicly stated goals of the evangelical movement in creating an alliance with the Republican Party will not have been achieved, even though there were 6 years of a Republican president, a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and an increasingly Republican judicial system. If you can't do it then, if you can't accomplish those things then, prayer won't be back in the public schools, won't be legal. When will you be able to achieve these things, if not then? So, one of the reasons white evangelicals got into this game in the first place was that they saw a possibility in an alliance with the Republican Party to achieve their political goals. That's not bad on them. That's what anybody would do. You're looking around the room and you say, who's going to get me where I need to go? And the Republican Party also had an interest in redrawing the party map of the United States, and white evangelicals helped them do that. So it was a marriage where both sides got something they very much wanted. But now, after this string of years where the Republican Party was very powerful, courtesy of a large white evangelical vote, many of the core goals of that movement will not have been achieved, and there are already signs that there are cracks, fissures inside that alliance. Not that they're all suddenly going to start voting Democratic, but leaders of large non-denominational churches around the country are wondering whether this was a good thing for them. Leaders of evangelical denominations wonder if so publicly and overtly creating an electoral alliance with one particular political party was really a good idea for them. And there's going to be some real reckoning that comes starting in January, and some real soul-searching about whether this was the way to go, strictly on a tactical and a strategic level. Was this a good thing for the Republican Party? Was it a good thing for the church? And those questions will be asked, and asked a lot, and asked privately, really. You're not going to see any of this happen in public. And you're already seeing some of those people backing away, pastors saying, I am going to cut down on my political involvement, no longer invite candidates. But at the same time, none of these are armies that march in lockstep. You saw 25 pastors openly flout the law regarding advocacy on behalf of political parties and candidates by making political speeches from their pulpit. They are challenging the law that denies tax-exempt status to religious institutions that politic, and they are, in fact, inviting the IRS to come after them so they can test that law. We'll see what happens. Michael Mukasey may take it up. I doubt Alberto Gonzalez would have. But we'll see. I mean, it's a very, very interesting thing for these pastors to openly challenge the tax code, openly challenge the law on this question, and so overtly bring politics into their pulpits. So there's stay tuned. There's a lot going on there. Yes.
Good evening, Mr. Suarez. Thank you for coming to Grand Rapids. My question, if you can tackle a little bit of it, is if you were the president of the United States, what would you do about immigration with a focus on Latino immigration?
Well, if I were president of the United States, we would have much, much cooler bands at state dinners. But beyond that, I don't think I want to say much. I will observe, however, that the workers who have come here across our southern border are parts of communications networks that run all the way from the border with Canada down to Tierra del Fuego. They are courtesy of phone cards and cell phones and immediate transportation, intimately connected with their hometowns. It's not like getting on a boat in Palermo in 1895 and coming to Boston or New York with the assumption that you may never see your hometown again. It's not like boarding a boat in Bergen, Norway, and heading out to the upper Midwest with the assumption that you're never going to live in Norway again. You can jump in your car in Kalamazoo in the early hours of the morning and probably catch a late-night snack with your mother in Durango if you split the driving with your buddies. It's not like other immigrations in other times. And those workers come here because they already know there is work. They know where their cousins work. They know where their brothers work. In many cases, they know where their fathers and mothers work. If there was no work, they would not come. And yet our entire approach to this problem has been employee-based rather than employer-based. We have laws on the books that sanction employers when they hire people who are out of status, but they are never enforced or rarely enforced or only occasionally enforced with the intention of having a showy effect. 12 million people don't get here by accident, and they are now enmeshed in our economy in a way that you ever have somebody drop sugar in your coffee as they're asking you whether you take sugar, and you don't? And, there's no way of getting sugar out of the coffee once it's in there. There is no way of running the American economy right now as it's constituted in several important sectors without people who are here out of status. So instead of having an adult conversation about this, we have a childlike conversation about this, where we land on simple formulas and simple suggestions. I moderated one of the Republican candidates' debates during this presidential election, and I asked all the assembled candidates, is it desirable and is it practical to send everybody home? I asked that question with the expectation that they would say, yes, it's desirable, and no, it's not practical, which at least would illustrate the subtlety of this problem. All of them, to my great surprise, said it was both desirable and practical. And I wondered just how many buses were going to be needed and where we were going to get them all. and whether we were ready for the collapse of the construction sector in Georgia, and ready for all the soft fruits in western Michigan not to get picked, and ready for all the apples in the Yakima Valley not to get picked, and ready for all the topiary in Orange County not to be cut. There was a time where only rich people had topiary. And now when you go to Southern California and you see mythical beasts and all that on people's lawns, and those same people hate immigrants, it just doesn't add up, you know? They used to have to cut their own damn hedges. And but I think everything that a lot of the conversation that we've had around this issue has been overly simplistic, overly emotional, and has yet to deal with the really serious problems brought up by both their presence and absence. You know, it's very simple to be sympathetic toward poor people who come here to make a better life and then have your analysis of it end right there. But there are lots of jobs in this country that used to pay a decent wage that don't anymore because they have become the precinct of out-of-status labor. And when they come in at the bottom of the wage scale, they compete against the people who are already working at the bottom of the wage scale. So if you were boning animals at a slaughterhouse and you used to get paid $15 an hour, you now get paid $9 an hour. And maybe aren't feeling particularly sympathetic toward people from Coahuila or Durango who are now making the 9 and aren't going to make the 15, and neither are you. It was one thing when these new workers were just laborers and doing odds and ends work on construction sites. But if they're doing wiring and drywalling, that has bid down the hourly pay for that work as well. That's fairly skilled work. When I do drywalling, it looks terrible afterwards. So I know that it's hard to come up with a wall that's perfectly flat and seamless and looks good. It's worth money to me. But if when you bring in teams of drywallers, presence of immigrant labor in a construction labor market bids down the hourly cost of that labor. That's a challenge too, and we shouldn't be mealy-mouthed or Pollyanna-ish about that either, because often who they're competing with are native-born workers who are unable to use their market power to bid up their wages, and their power to negotiate higher wages is undercut by the presence of workers who aren't supposed to be in the country. So, it's a really, really tough problem. And instead we submit it to simple formulas and blithe pronouncements and send them all home and all that stuff, and it's just ridiculous. We should have a government of adults. That's my it's my wish list for Christmas. Thank you.
Good evening. You talked quite a bit, for moments in your speech, about the candidates and their VP candidates, and really being almost a personality or contest, and trying to see who you connect with on that personal level. And there's so much energy, and there's so many people working. I think this year I was asked if I was registered about 12 times during this whole season. And it's exciting to see all that energy. Will we see those people, the people that are part of these campaigns, so they're on the partisan sides, once whoever's elected on November 5th is there, will we see these people who had this energy start working on issues and get away from the partisan? Where will all this energy go? Because right now there's so many people, it seems like a lot of intelligent people, but they're working on two opposite sides. Will we see these two opposite sides come together and start working on issues to fix, our communities and our country?
I'm glad you asked me that, because as I've been watching and talking to the partisans working hard on both sides to get their guy in, I wonder whether all of them, or even most of them, will be able to reconcile themselves to the new president if their guy doesn't win. And if the next president takes office with 49% of the country against them, that's not going to be good for the country. I hope there'll be a sort of greatness of spirit and enough worry about the urgent national challenges that even if the next president wins with 51% of the vote, that when that person takes the oath in January, they can hope for the support, allegiance, best wishes of more than 51% of the voters. I used to be more confident in assuming that that would happen than I am this time. There's a lot of hardness of heart on both sides. And the excited Obama partisans who bitterly expect that McCain people won't support their guy, if he is elected, if they were really being honest about it, they would have to cop to the fact that they wouldn't be too happy about John McCain taking the oath in January either. So I'm not really all that optimistic, at least in the near term, about Americans in a very bitterly and closely divided country being ready to put down their arms once this thing is decided. Yes, sir.
Just wanted to have you make a few comments on the Electoral College. Some writers had said that the Democratic candidate in the last few elections has been at a disadvantage because of, the small towns and the farm people tending toward conservative thought and voting Republican. Would you say that, when you look at the maps from the last couple elections, it appears that Mr. Obama would need to win Ohio and Florida, or else a couple states out in the west or in the south to become president. You have a few comments on that?
The map is really fascinating this time around. And because he is so well funded, and I should point out that Barack Obama has raised more money than any candidate ever for any office. It's kind of an amazing thing. But because he has so much money, he's able to play in traditionally Republican states and force John McCain to spend time and resources there. It's one of the lesser talked about effects of the map. When you see McCain having to campaign in Indiana, having to spend time in Florida, having to spend time, as he was the other day, in Colorado. It's fascinating to, now with the internet, there are all these websites where they have interactive maps. You can take states in and out of different candidates' totals and add them up and see what it does to the Electoral College and so on. It's really, I'm such an idiot. I'm such a geek. Fun. This is what I've come to now. I'm sitting there, wonder about Ohio. But Republicans had complaints about the Democrats when big empty states voted for Democrats. And now that big empty states vote for Republicans, Democrats complain that that's unfair to them. Do I think it's going to result in a revisiting of the advisability of continuing with the Electoral College? No, I don't. Just as I don't think there's going to be proportional representation in the Senate, so that Sarah Palin's Alaska will continue to have 2 senators for 638,000 people, and California will have 2 senators for its 34 million people. That's really the generating engine of the disequilibrium in the Electoral College, the lack of proportional representation in the Senate, because you get one electoral vote for each of your House members and then 2 for your senatorial delegation. So the big empty states have disproportionate power in the Electoral College that's built in. What is a more tantalizing prospect to consider is what some states speculate about every 4 years, which is to take away the winner-take-all formula and do it by congressional district instead, which would suddenly throw the map into utter disarray. It is interesting. Every Democrat starts out thinking, well, all right, I got California, and I got New York, and I got Massachusetts, and I got Illinois. I'm already doing pretty good before we start to fight in these other places. And any Republican looks at the map and says, well, I got Texas, and I got here and there and these other places, and so I'm starting, and I got all those big empty states. So now let's rumble. But if you break it down by congressional district, suddenly the whole act of running for president, I make clear what I mean, instead of the winner of California's contest winning all of California's electoral votes, it would be the winner inside each congressional district which would get the electoral vote from that district, and then the winner of the state would get the 2 votes that represent the senatorial seats. So California, instead of giving 52 to the Democrats right off the bat, would suddenly give, 29 or 31 to the Democrats and 21 to the Republicans, because the way the maps are drawn in these states, there are a lot of Republicans in California. It may not seem that way, but there are actually a lot of Republicans in California. And suddenly Illinois, instead of giving all its electoral votes to Barack Obama, would have a split electoral college delegation. Those proposals are usually smothered in the cradle by phalanxes of lawyers who go running to the state capitol whenever somebody breathes a word about it. But 2 states, for you geeky political trivia buffs, do already split it that way. For the door prize, which states are they? Maine and Nebraska. Very good. Give that. And the only reason it doesn't attract much attention is because Maine and Nebraska are small. If they were big, it would attract a lot of attention. So I wouldn't look for a revisiting of the Electoral College anytime soon. And if Barack Obama achieves his ambition of redrawing the map, which he's already gone a long way toward, just that it's close in Virginia and close in Colorado and Nevada, means that something's afoot, and he's forcing the Republicans to play there just by changing the map. So it makes it gives you a situation where the Democrats can actually lose Minnesota and Iowa, and it's not fatal to their chances. If Obama wins enough of these close states, he can even lose Ohio. He can lose Pennsylvania. It's kind of amazing. But that's, it's a good strategy, but it's only a possible strategy because he's got bucket loads of money, which I guess comes from you people. Certainly doesn't come from me. So it's a fascinating thing to consider. But the Electoral College has come in and out of favor as population trends have shifted in the country and as political trends have shifted in the country. A lot of the most solidly Democratic places on the map 100 years ago are the most solidly Republican places on the map today. Perhaps 100 years from now, if we're all still here, there'll be the roles will be reversed again. Or we can speculate about Alberta and Manitoba's electoral votes as well. I mean, you've heard about that North American Union, right? That the Bilderbergers and the Illuminati are trying to force us all into one country and create a transnational currency. Well, when you're all facing Mecca to pray, you'll remember you heard from me. You heard it from me first. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, we're just going to take these last 3 questions, and then Mr. Suarez will be available for book signing. So, go ahead.
Hi. Do you know if it's possible from a journalistic standpoint and objectively to do more coverage on one-issue voters? Because I find very frustrating in the elections is people that I talk to vote for candidates for one reason, whether it's through Bush, a lot of people voted for him for national security, or gender, or, like we were talking about, religious reasons, or, any number of reasons. And I just wish there was more coverage on the dangers of being a one-issue voter. And sometimes, when you look at these polls, you have to do that to label and find out how people are voting, but they do the polls, but they don't talk about the dangers of voting for somebody just because of gender or, because they're working class or not.
Voters vote for who they want. I mean, for all kinds of reasons. I understand that you've come to the opinion that single-issue voting is dangerous, but what if they were single-issue voting on an issue that you very much agreed with them on? I don't know if you'd find it nearly as dangerous. And single-issue voting, I think, rises and falls. Yesterday's single-issue voter isn't necessarily today's, and even if you were a single-issue voter in the last 3 presidential elections, they might have been in 3 different issues. I find that even people who self-identify as single-issue voters tend to have a grab bag of things that get them all wound up. And I'm not sure how I would approach covering it, but go to the Pew Center on the People in the Press and look at their polling. And they ask a lot of very specific issue questions and see the kind of responses they get on the different hot issues of the day. And I think you'll find it interesting. Yes.
You mentioned there were large numbers of immigrants who naturalized and registered to vote. Do you think that because of that the immigration issue will play any part in this election, or will the economy just override all those immigrant votes?
I don't think immigration enjoyed a real spike in interest and passion and public outrage. And then as other things started to get really bad, immigration sort of subsided. It's there. I mean, the people who were upset about it then are still upset about it today. But boy, you can listen to C-SPAN all day and not hear any of the candidates mention it at all. It's just not one of the big 3 or 4 issues sending people to the polls these days. It will. I mean, John McCain has made a point of saying border security first. So first, let's build the barriers, let's keep the borders from being porous, keep those coyotes and the teams of people that they lead over the border out of the country. Do that first, and then start to talk about a long-term, durable solution to the problem. Barack Obama hasn't really mentioned it. I haven't heard him mention it in the last 6 months. It's just waned as an issue. And, I think if the current economic trends continue for a couple of months, a lot of people are going to stop coming, too, because the kinds of jobs that they do are going to be some of the first jobs to go. And native-born workers will once again be back in the competition for many of those jobs. So the very efficient information networks that bring workers here will also tell them There's ICE raids, they're dropping the wages, they're hiring fewer people, and I suspect that the flow, especially in the heavy crossing points in Arizona and California, will start to dry up. So immigration will have its legacy in its effect on the final vote because of those people who naturalized and in the majority registered as Democrats because of the threat they felt from the tone of the debate. But immigration itself as an issue, I don't think is going to play very large in a final tally.
Hi, Ray. In the world of thinkers, I consider you a rock star, and
thanks.
I want to thank you for that. I'm struck by the irony that in this age of information, we have such rancor, such disparity among people with their ideas and attitudes, and folks don't want to get together and practice some critical thinking and listen to both sides of an issue. I wake up in the morning with NPR. During the day, I listen to Sean Hannity and Rush Limbaugh. At night, I'm back with NPR and the BBC. And I'm always trying to, critical thinking. In the late 60s, when I was a college student, I would have killed for this kind of information. So everyone has this information. It's instantaneous. You're sitting in front of the net, and all these headlines are popping up. We, in the 60s, thought we would have a world if we could sit down and hear everybody's viewpoints, we could make the world a better place. But what is the cause of this? Is it fear? Because like you said, the ground is shifting and people aren't sure what it means to be an American. Is it, as an educator, is it something we're not doing with critical thinking? Is it, is it something the news media needs to do? Where can we begin to bring people together again?
I think there is a crisis of authority. There's nobody who could walk up to this lectern and say something that everybody in the room would believe because they said it. And we have gotten to this weird era where facts don't matter so much anymore. And that scares the heck out of me as a reporter because I'm in the fact business. And when, for instance, how many of you watched Sarah Palin's acceptance speech as the Republican vice presidential nominee? Okay, a very healthy number. In that speech, she said famously that she said thanks but no thanks to the bridge to nowhere. That if they were going to thank you, federal government, but if we're going to build a bridge, we'll build it ourselves. My business went ahead and did what it's supposed to do in those cases and checked whether or not that was indeed the case. We found that no, it was not the case. Sarah Palin lobbied for the bridge to nowhere, supported the bridge to nowhere, and when it became a political hot potato and the laughingstock of the rest of the country, just took the money and didn't build the bridge. Okay, so we did our due diligence. We put it in our papers and on our television newscasts and on our radio and in our magazines. And if you tuned into the television a week later, 10 days later, 14 days later, what was Governor Palin saying in her stump speech? That she had said thanks, but no thanks to the bridge to nowhere. And in response to saying that, got rapturous applause because we had arrived at a point where those people giving her rapturous applause for saying that were not applauding so much because she turned down a bridge, but they were applauding because she was still saying that, even though media toads like me had gone and discredited that point in her stump speech. The reality at the core of this thing, what really happened to the money, what really happened to the bridge, when she was for it and when she was against it, was almost besides the point. Because now it was a shirts and skins match between bad old us, who inconveniently pointed out that she wasn't telling the truth, and her, who was going to insist on continuing to tell that story even though those media people are saying bad things about me. And I watched that, and I was a little depressed, I have to tell you. Because, not that I expect, I mean, this is politics and this is reality, not that I expect her to fall on her sword or say in the next speech, I'm sorry I said that and I wasn't telling the truth, and in full disclosure, I love that bridge. No, I wasn't expecting that. But what I was expecting was that the Bridge to Nowhere passage in the movements of the symphony that is Sarah Palin would be dropped from the work. That this would become actually a risky gambit to continue to say something that had been demonstrated in the public square to not be true. But instead of being a risky gambit, it became a badge of honor to continue to say something that was not true to an audience that loved you. So it was and this isn't about Sarah Palin in particular. It was just a handy example, because facts don't matter. And if we live in a world where facts don't matter, then you'll be able to get a loan with no money down for a house you can't afford, and stocks that were worth $50 a share will end up being worth $5 a share, because what we knew about the value of the company, crazy, it wasn't true. So in fact, the facts will come and explode in your face. I mean, I have a very serious sense of vocation and a very serious sense of mission about what I do for a living. I'm actually very square and old-fashioned and idealistic about all that stuff. I may kid about it, but I just spent the last 30 years of my life doing this stuff, and I take it very seriously. And when we have come to a point where facts don't matter, we are in real trouble. When the believability or the importance of a fact is tempered by who delivered the fact rather than by whether or not it's true, we're in some real trouble. So what do we hear now in the discourse? What do we hear out there? You say to somebody, well, I heard that this and this was the case, and they'll say, oh yeah, where? And you say, well, I heard it on NPR. As our questioner mentioned, she listens to NPR in the morning and at night. Actually, about 22 million people listen to Morning Edition and All Things Considered. So they'd say, well, it's a liberal network. Not whether it's true. It doesn't matter whether it's true. I heard it on NPR. So now the issue at dispute becomes not whether this thing is true. Sun rises in the east, sets in the west. There's two non-contiguous parts of Michigan, yet they're part of the same state. Uncontrovertible, true facts are somehow less true if I don't like the person who said it, or the kind of people who listened to that place who delivered the fact are the kind of people I disagree with, or on and on and on. That is the road to crazy land, when there's no longer a patch of ground that we can stand on and argue with each other, that we can objectively say, yes, this is true ground that we're standing on, and we're going to hash this out. Instead, you get to bring your facts, and I get to bring my facts. And we use the privilege of simply not believing each other's facts because of where they come from. That is the road to crazy land, and we are well down it. So that kind of stuff isn't going to be changed by this election. In fact, if anything, this election has made it all worse. So I, in my least optimistic, idealistic, and charitable moments, get pretty bummed out by that kind of stuff, where someone in a position of public responsibility gets up and says something that is simply false. And if you say, hey, pal, that's false, they blame you because you're biased. I'm biased in favor of the truth. That's why my paycheck cashes. And I could go on all night about this. This is a really big problem. This crisis in authority means that we really can't talk about anything and come to some kind of common wisdom, because we all just think, well, yeah, of course he said that. He's this. You should see the letters that come into PBS whenever I do a story on immigration. Whenever I do a story on immigration, people write in frothing. How can you let him do a story on immigration, clearly biased, blah, 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 and they assume that I'm Mexican. No, not that it matters, but I'm not Mexican. My people crossed the treacherous Atlantic Ocean from Puerto Rico to Brooklyn in an airplane. And when they got off at the other end, they got their bags and they got picked up at the airport and they went to Brooklyn. No papers, no stamps, no nothing. It's just not an issue for us. But the assumption is that because I look like how I look and I got a name like I got, I am biased. I am biased in favor of whoever you're against in this formulation, these people who write these letters. All right, look, it hurts my feelings a little bit because, like I said, I'm very much in the truth business. But you should also see the even uglier letters that we get at the NewsHour, because Gwen Ifill, my colleague, has been covering the presidential race, and anyone who's ever watched the NewsHour knows, or since so many of you watch the vice presidential debates, you know that Gwen Ifill is black. No secret there. Barack Obama, as you might have heard, also black. And the letters are ferocious and really, in many cases, very ugly. They all make the accusation that she's, in the tank and biased toward Obama and blah, blah, blah. And in some cases, these letters come in after a night when Gwen is simply anchoring the program and doesn't do any of the reports that come after the news summary. So all she's done is read some general news about where Barack Obama was today. And I don't know how you can be biased about saying Barack Obama was in Virginia. Again, he was either in Virginia or he wasn't. But they write in anyway. I don't know how you can have Gwen Ifill reporting on Barack Obama. It's unbelievable. I'm never going to watch again. If only they were telling the truth. They watch again so we can make them mad because, hey, tune in tomorrow. I might be covering immigration. It is a really, really problematic thing. We seem to have lost the ability to do any serious content analysis based on the content. Here are the facts in evidence. What do you conclude? Don't look at me. I'm not the story. The story's the story. It's a really, really rough thing. I'm kidding about it, but it's a really, really big problem. The numbers that we get on trust in the media are frightening, because as the world gets more and more complex with every year, there's no way you can know empirically why a lot of the things that are happening in our world are happening, except from people like me. And if you don't think we're telling the truth, what are you going to do? How many people in this room can explain why suddenly there wasn't enough electricity in California? All right, some, but I'll submit not many. California, bustling state, lots of people, refrigerators, recharging iPods, doing whatever it is that Californians do. Then one day there's not enough electricity. Was there a sudden upsurge in the number of Californians? No. Was there a sudden upsurge in the amount of electricity they were using? No. Then how come they didn't have electricity? It was very complicated. You had one set of sources unless you were going to go to California, which you weren't. But if you don't believe the news business, how else are you going to know? How else are you going to know why things are happening in the world if you don't believe the news business? This is a very important rant for me. I'm going to have to come back. Yes.
Good evening. My question is related to one of your last comments. As a Latino, I'm very interested in immigration issues, education, and healthcare. But as a Latino that was born and raised in Puerto Rico and lived for almost 30 years in the island.
When did you sneak in?
Sorry?
When did you sneak in?
About 4 years ago.
Okay.
So I wasn't allowed to vote in any presidential election because I was living in Puerto Rico. And I would like to know if you have a suggestion for us, how we can have our voice to be heard, because we have other issues that are very important for us, like the colonial relationship with the U.S., our political status, etc. What can we do as a community at the national level to have our voice to be heard and start discussing these issues at the national level?
That's a tough question. How come the last question of the night has to be one of the toughest questions? I find that Americans are mostly unaware or don't understand the status of Puerto Rico. It's not that they're hostile or uncaring or angry about anything. They just don't understand it. And so people ask me, for instance, why does Puerto Rico get to have a party political primary? And I tell them I don't know. Because really, if you can't vote for the president, who cares whether you think Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama should be the Democratic nominee? Because by that time, only McCain was really left in the race. So it was only the Democratic primary that was very significant. The sad tragedy to me about Puerto Rico is that the island's politics are almost entirely hostage to status questions. The political parties are based around status questions. If you're PNP as opposed to Popular, what's the real difference in your approach to how to govern the island? Your understanding and your answer to the question of status. So while this tumult is going on in the island, sort of existential questions about what does it mean to be a Puerto Rican, what does it mean to be an American, America is sailing blithely, happily on without even understanding what it is that all that tumult is about, or even aware that it's going on. So, you have these tremendous cataclysmic confrontations over the privatization of the utilities, for instance. Tremendous national debate. And even the close parts of America, in Florida or someplace. They don't know. They don't know that it's even going on. Yet, there's very little entree into the American national debate for Puerto Ricans, and very little that the continuing challenge of status means to America. So it's something of great consequence to us and no consequence to them, except if there was a binding vote on the future of the island. All these referenda over the years, the plebiscitos, have been non-binding. And if there was a binding vote on Puerto Rico's future, and both John McCain and Barack Obama have said if there was a binding vote on Puerto Rico's future, they would immediately draft legislation in the Congress that would respect the result of that binding vote. Would America want 4 million basically Spanish-speaking new citizens with 6 members of the House and 2 senators?
We are citizens already.
Yes, you're citizens already, but only represented by 1 delegate in the House of Representatives, who has only a vote in committee and not a vote on the final passage of legislation. So until Puerto Rico can come to Washington and say, here's what we want, and force Washington to respond to it, I think we'll continue in this era of mutual incomprehension and mutual ignorance. Yes, if the binding resolution came up with a vote for statehood, wouldn't that be a challenge to the rest of the country? Because suddenly Puerto Rico would be very important to people who never think about it at all. And if it continued with Estado Libre Asociado, who would even know? I mean, this has been a frustrating thing for me, obviously, but it is a fascinating story. The seizure of Puerto Rico to be basically a coaling station for American naval ships, and then 110 years of studied ignorance of the place and what's going on there and how the people are doing and all of that stuff. So if you want to read some interesting history, read a history of the United States involvement in Puerto Rico, which is in turns at best shameful, occasionally horrifying, depending on the decade you're reading about, until you finally get the first Puerto Rican governor of the island, 54 years after the Marines splashed ashore in Guanica and raised the American flag. 54 years. 50 years before there was even a governor who could speak Spanish. It's a remarkable story, but because Puerto Rico is so small, it was able to be sort of victimized by ignorance. Not outward hostility, not actual aggression, but sort of the kind of ignoring of it that magnified all the problems there and made them worse. I think it's very difficult for Puerto Rico's challenges and problems and issues to make much impact on a place so big and so unaware of the world outside its own borders as the United States. So there's good coverage of Puerto Rico in the New York Daily News, and that's about it. Thank you very much. Buy my book.
For those of you who would like to have Mr. Suarez sign a book, he will be out in the foyer in just a few minutes to do so. Thank you again for coming, and have a wonderful night.